Well, here's some little stories for you guys. I was putting some things together on a few jobs that we had done, and this one, this picture right here is one that I borrowed from one of my students that was looking at a noise down there in his belt area, and I went out there and I was kind of tickled when I saw he had a fence post, propping his hood up, and it made a cool picture, and I use it occasionally for a header for stuff every now and then. But anyway, we're going to start out talking about this Dodge Stratus, and it came with us with three primary concerns. One of them was a PO128. Now, a PO128 and a PO125 are very similar codes, and what they do, let me take this off of here, and what the PO128 and the PO125 typically both point to the thermostat. Now, there are occasional exceptions to this, like for example, if you've got a late 90s Toyota that's throwing you, like a Camry, that's throwing you a PO125, then the oxygen sensor heater can actually cause it to throw that code because it's taken too long for it to drop into closed loop fuel control. And there's an algorithm apparently that's typed in there. The reason I know that is because my son had for a while he was driving a 1998 Camry, and he lives about 6 hours from here, and he was calling me and said it kept throwing that code, and they put a thermostat in it. It still threw a 125, and oddly enough, that particular car never threw any kind of a code for an oxygen sensor heater, as I remember. But what it did do was it threw that 125 code until the oxygen sensor heater problem was straightened out. After that, the 125 code went away. And so there's a little bit of something going on there. This thermostat right here is literally the one that came out of that Dodge that I was talking about. And sometimes thermostats break like that, and this one here, it happened that way. And so, but we put the thermostat in there, and we got a nice warm engine. Now, that's not the temperature gauge for that Stratus, obviously. It's one I just took a picture of. But it needs to run about, for good emissions, and a healthy engine needs to run a little over 200 degrees. Matter of fact, if you look up something like some of your Chevrolet Cavaliers, your older ones like 97 or whatever, and some of them in the early 00s, they won't even turn on their fan. Some of them, I ran into a couple of them that didn't turn on their fan until the coolant got to 228. And so you got to make sure that you understand that. But if it's not running up in the middle of the gauge, then you've got one that's running too cold, most likely. That'll cause you not to have any cabin heat in the winter, but it also causes deeper problems with the engine, and it can cause it to sludge up and get poor fuel economy and that kind of thing. So it needs to run nice and warm. Some of the old school people like for the thing to run really cold all the time. Some of them, they figured the colder the better. They didn't like having any heat back in those days, and because of the fact that so many people were doing the short trips and running, without thermostats or with thermostats that weren't working right, then they would wind up with sludged up engines. And of course, I mentioned a week or so ago, they checked that on, maybe a couple of weeks ago, they would blame that on Quaker State Oil when Quaker State Oil didn't have anything to do with it. But the one that, if you've got a sludge problem, if there has been a problem with sludge, then chances are the vehicle, there's a lot of talk about using the wrong kind of oil. That can cause it. There's a lot of talk about waiting too long to do oil changes. That can cause it somewhat. But short, cold drives can cause it too, and also a thermostat that's running the engine too cold all the time. I don't know if any of you guys could ever have a story about a vehicle that you worked on that you couldn't figure out. And I had a Ford Ranger, if I'm not mistaken, it was a 99 model that we piddled with in there. And this old guy that was driving it, he had some kind of a job, and he was a chase truck for semis or something. He was an older man, and he had a Ranger with a 2.5 in it. It was a 99 or a 2000 model, and he had a logbook where he kept track of his mileage because he had to do that for business purposes. And he was not a kook or a wacko. He was a smart guy. Did a lot of his own mechanic work, just an older man that had been around a long time, old school thinker. And he told me that truck had 900,000 miles on it. I didn't have any reason to disbelieve him, besides he had a logbook to prove it. Long and the short of it was, he couldn't get any cabin heat. And the only way that we could get him any cabin heat, and I'll tell you what, we did everything we could to get cabin heat for that thing, bleeding the cooling system, every kind of way you could think. But it was always running too cold. But if we put a stiff piece of fiberboard with some holes, 2-inch holes drilled in it with a hole saw here, there, and yonder, if we put that in front of the radiator, then it would warm up and get some cabin heat. Of course, the thermostat, the water pump, even the head gasket had been replaced on this thing, and it had been burped and bled every 6 ways from Sunday on the cooling system. And maybe somebody listening to this video says, "Oh yes, I know exactly what you need to do." Well, hooray for you, because we never did figure that one out. That guy, he never could get any cabin heat. I don't know if he's had any yet, but that was just a kind of a funny story to me. A lot of times people don't want to admit it if they messed up and couldn't figure one out, but that would beat us up. Anyway, in the old days, thermostats would stick closed. It seemed to me like a lot of the time, whenever we would do an overheating problem back in the 70s, or even the early 80s, it would be a stuck closed thermostat. And then I started noticing a difference. It seemed like more often than not, and I don't know if the thermostat designers changed this up, the thermostat would stick open a little bit like this one. Either that, or the spring would get weak, or something would happen that would cause it to start opening too soon. And that was an interesting thing to me, to see that change on the fly. You might also notice this little bleed hole right here on this thermostat here. When you're putting a thermostat in, if it's sitting in there flat like this, you don't need to worry about where that hole is. But if it's sitting vertical, that bleed hole needs to be at the top, because that's how it lets air out of the block when you're filling the cooling system up, and it's less likely to get airbound if it's got a thermostat with one of those little bleed holes in it. But I was at a coffee shop, and I used to hang out at Sambo's and a couple other coffee shops in Port Arthur, Texas, back in the late 70s when I was working down there doing fleet maintenance. There was some knothead, self-proclaimed, I don't even think the guy had a job, but there's an awful lot of people that'll tell you that they're a really good mechanic and can fix anything, yet they don't have a job. I never understood those folks. Long and the short of it is, this guy was telling me, if you take the thermostat out of an engine, it will overheat every single time. I just didn't get that. Couldn't convince him otherwise. And I said, well, how many thermostats have I ever seen took out and the car runs bone cold? That's just crazy. Well, the long and the short of it is, you can actually, occasionally, if you had a vehicle that the holes in the head gasket were a little eat out, because between the engine block and the head gasket, the water passages, the holes in the gasket are small, so that the coolant won't go through there so fast that it doesn't have time to carry the heat away. And if the head gasket's rotted out, or if the radiator is really, really thin and only has one row of flues in it, so that the coolant's traveling too fast, then taking the thermostat out might cause it to overheat, but that is the exception, a very rare exception, and not the rule. Of course, this guy right here went away convinced that he was completely correct about everything he was saying. And it says there's no car that won't overheat if you take the thermostat out. That was his argument. But basically, what I discovered and what I told my boys when I was raising them, I says, if you know that you know what you're talking about, and you're talking to somebody that claims that they are right and you're wrong, all you have to do is state your case clearly and then walk away, because sooner or later they're going to find out that you were right. Okay? On this one here, we had this Lackluster AC on that same car. It didn't cool well on hot days, and the ambient temperature was about 70 degrees, so it's difficult sometimes. You might even have one that will seems to cool pretty good at night, but it won't cool good in the daytime. Or if it's a cool day like that, it might feel like it cools pretty good, but it won't cool good if the weather warms up. And so that's what we were looking at on this one right here. But look at these pressures. We identified the refrigerant first as 100% R134 because I didn't like hooking this big machine up to it, not knowing what was in there. And so what I did was I found the low side was pulling really close to zero and the high side was running kind of low. And it, you know, that was whenever you started it up and turned on the AC, this is where the needles would go. And so the static readings being the readings that your AC gauges are giving you whenever the everything has equalized on both sides of the expansion valve orifice, and you put those gauges on there and you read static readings. Now you can tell if there's refrigerant in there, but static readings are totally unreliable as far as telling you anything other than there's a pretty good bit of refrigerant in there. But I have seen the static readings on the gauges both be up about 100 pounds, but when you started it up, it still, you know, was low on refrigerant and stuff. And even at the Mobile Air Conditioning Society convention, they'll tell you that static readings will only give you a little bit of information. You cannot hook the gauges up and say, well, I got 100 pounds of static pressure on both sides, so that means everything's okay. That's hogwash. When you start it up and the compressor starts doing its work, that's when you can look at the readings on your gauges and get an idea of what's going on. And that's what we did here. But we needed to know how much refrigerant this thing had in it. Now, venting refrigerant to the atmosphere is highly illegal and will cause you to be fined $32,000 in some places if they catch you doing it. It's basically federally against the law. It's not just California or places like that. But the long and the short of it is, you know, you may not ever have to pay a fine, but don't vent refrigerant to the atmosphere. If you don't have a good way to get it out of there, then just leave it alone and let somebody else work on it. But what we did here, we basically used the machine to evacuate what was in there. Now the thing about it is, what you need to do, if you want to get it all out of there, you need to warm the engine compartment up. And I'm not talking about running the air conditioner, but you're going to start the motor and you're going to run the engine until the engine compartment, all the stuff in there gets too hot to touch. And then you hook your hoses up and you turn on your, or you can actually leave your hoses hooked up to the machine or whatever. When that thing gets just blistering hot under the hood, where it's really, 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 really hot, then you pull the refrigerant out of it. And after you put, you know, the newest machines, the J2788s, are supposed to get all the refrigerant out, or almost all of it in, 20 minutes or something like that. I don't remember the exact specs. This old machine we had would do a good job, but you had to know what you were doing. Now, the reason I'm saying this, I had a Jeep, this yellow Jeep Cherokee that you might have seen in some of my previous videos. And one day I was there by myself, and I just like to, occasionally I'd pull the refrigerant out of it and make sure that it had a good, the right charge in it. And so I was working in my office one day, and I pulled that Jeep into the shop and I hooked the machine up to it, and I told it to pull the refrigerant out. And so I let it pull the refrigerant out, and both gauges went into the negative, and it told me that it had pulled out 1.2 pounds of refrigerant. Well, it held 1.25, and so whatever happened, the phone rang or something. I went back in my office and I stayed in there talking on the phone and doing some other work. I was there by myself that day for probably 25 minutes. And when I went back out there, that refrigerant had outgassed. The oil in the accumulator captures refrigerant. It's kind of like CO2 in Dr. Pepper or something, and it bubbles out of the refrigerant, and pressure rises in the system. And whenever you see that, that means that you need to do your recovery again and get the refrigerant out of it that has outgassed from the oil that's in the accumulator and in other places. So, and there's some puddled up in the compressor too. Long and short of it, I pulled that thing and I did about 3 different extractions on that thing, letting it outgas every time. And by the time I did all the math and got all the refrigerant out that was in that 1.25 pound system, I found out I had over 2 pounds of refrigerant in a 1.25 pound system. Now sometimes, depending on the system, that'll cause the pressure to go too high and it not cool. You get too much refrigerant in there, it won't cool either. So too much is not better. A little more is not better. So what I did was I put the 1.25 back in it, and it actually cooled a little better than it had been before. But anyway, if you want to get all the refrigerant out, and it's a cold day or it's cold in the shop, you want to make doggone sure you give it time to outgas and pull it as many times as you need to get all that refrigerant out of there. You'll wind up overcharging it. It's just really important to do that. Well, on this particular one, it only held a pound, and it had the right amount of refrigerant in it. We ran through all this procedure of heating it up under the hood and all that. You'll get more of it like that the first time. You usually get it all. And so the refrigerant wasn't the problem. So what we did right here, it got an expansion valve. We put an expansion valve on it, and the pressure's normalized, and we had good cold air. That's all it took to fix that one. Sometimes the expansion valve, you might remember this Ford Edge. It was a 2012 Ford Edge that we worked on, that they were trying to, it would cool for about 30 minutes driving down the road, and then it would quit cooling. And they told her, she went to the Ford place somewhere, and they told her it needed everything that was under the dash because the actuators weren't communicating on the bus, all that kind of stuff. So she didn't want to pay them $1,500 to do all that work, so she basically brought it over there, and I let it run until it quit cooling. And with my gauges on it, I could tell the the expansion valve had, something had gone wrong in that because the pressures went wacky like that, and we lost the coolant. Put a $16 expansion valve on it, and she had good cold air, and she still has to this very day. And that was like 3 or 4 years ago. The flex joint on the Stratus was coming apart inside here. It needs the flex joint because the engine torques, and it needs some way to move. Well, that flex joint inside this right here, there's kind of a flexible piece of pipe, and that little woven mesh, you can't really look at it and tell. But whenever we cranked it up and got under there, you could hear exhaust leaking out of here, and they were actually smelling the exhaust inside the car. And so in that particular case, you got a couple of choices. It's part of the catalytic converter, but you can buy just that joint nowadays, and you can whack off the front of the catalytic converter and weld that back on there. You got to make sure it's indexed right and all that. And you can just replace the flex joint if there's nothing wrong with the catalyst. It's a lot cheaper to replace the flex joint than it is to put a new catalyst on it. Anyway, same day, Pontiac, Montana had an illuminated MIL, check engine light, and a thermostat code, another thermostat code, and beyond that, the blower would sometimes just stop blowing. And so she could slap the silencer panel under the dash beneath the glove box, and the blower would wake up and run for a while. As a matter of fact, this was an earlier job, but this lady's the same one that owned the Ford Edge that I was just talking about. So anyway, I assigned the thermostat replacement to Jesse, and he was confused because the shop manual's instructions acted like you had to remove this crossover pipe that goes from the back to the front. And so I told him, I said, you don't have to do that because this thing's got a slotted hole down there. It doesn't look like it'll come out of there, but it will. And so whenever he loosened that bottom bolt, took the top one off, he was able to work that thing out of there without taking that pipe off. Matter of fact, if I'm not mistaken, there's a bulletin on that that told all of the mechanics that you didn't have to take that exhaust crossover pipe off to do that. Well, he was going to put a thermostat on it. We had a aftermarket thermostat, and this part stored gasket was too fat, and it absolutely would not go back in there. He couldn't get it back in. He worried with it. So finally I ordered an OEM gasket from the dealer. These that have the rubber ring that go around the thermostat will usually come with that rubber ring. If a thermostat takes a paper gasket nowadays, because they're using the same thermostat for a lot of different part numbers, they don't give you a gasket with the thermostat anymore like they did for so many years. You got to buy the gasket separately. It only cost a couple of dollars anyway. But one way or another, he finally, when he put that on there, he got that. But I will say that when I was fighting with a cold engine, like at the Ford place, we would get, I'd get another thermostat out of the parts room and it would still run cold, and then I'd get another thermostat and it would still run cold, and I was just like, what the heck is this? And one time I had to put 4 thermostats in before it ever started getting warm, and that was pretty disgusting. But on my yellow Jeep one time, it started running cold, and on the Jeep temperature gauge. It had numbers so you could tell pretty much what the temperature was. And it was usually running up around 210, but I noticed it was running down around 120. It just started running too cold. And I said, okay, this will be a teaching experience. I can show them how you take the thermostat out and put it in water and heat the water up with a torch with a thermometer in the water, and you can see when the thermostat opens. And on that particular one, we heated that thing up, and the thermostat opened at about 210. And I said, well, I don't know exactly what that means, but I know that the engine was running too cold. And so I went ahead and just got another thermostat, because they don't cost much, and I put that in there, and it warmed it right up. On another occasion, I may have mentioned before, I was doing a vehicle inspection on a Crown Victoria, and I had the wireless vehicle interface from, I'm trying to remember who it was that made that thing. I had that thing for years. Anyway, it doesn't matter. I had it so that I could watch the engine coolant temperature on the computer screen with the big yellow numbers. And so I'm watching this Crown Victoria. I like to warm it up, you know, and to make sure it's getting as warm as it's supposed to get, even though it wasn't throwing a code. I just wanted to make sure that it was getting as warm as it needed to get. That was a standard thing I did on a lot of the vehicle inspections I did, to make sure the engine was reaching operating temperature or wasn't running too hot. You know, if the fan kicks on and it keeps getting hotter and hotter and hotter, that means there's something wrong. But if the fan kicks on, it cools off, and the fan kicks on, it cools off, and then the fan kicks back off, you know everything's kind of working like it's supposed to. But on this particular one, that Crown Victoria would not get hotter idling in the service bay than 160 degrees. That's as hot as it would get. And so I says, well, I'm going to do something about this. I happened to, over there by my coffee table, I had a couple of thermostats in boxes that were new ones, that were brand new for a Crown Victoria, and they had the little O-ring with them and all that. And so I shut that car off. It was still hooked to the wireless vehicle interface. And I took that thermostat housing loose. It's real easy on them Crown Vics, you know, pop it loose. Lifted that thermostat with its old O-ring out, put the new thermostat in there. It was made by Stant with a pretty orange O-ring. Put it back on, tightened it back down, fired it up, and within 5 minutes that thing had warmed up to 195 degrees. I never understood how that thing picked up that much temperature that fast right after I changed the thermostat. You know, you couldn't ordinarily do that on anything you know, where the thermostat was in a harder place to get to. But that was just the craziest thing I ever saw. Anyway, this one right here, this turned into a near disaster. A lot of you guys would be familiar with the 2.7 liter engines in these cars here. Don't you just love those 2.7s that has the timing chain driving the water pump, and it has the you know, Ford, when they made this engine that's in the edge, they've got the water pump down inside the timing cover being driven by the chain, but they weren't as smart as Chrysler was on this one. Chrysler, the weep holes for the water pump, if it's leaking on a Chrysler, one of them is down by the thermostat. It actually channels the water down, and it goes out a hole next to where the thermostat is. It's the front of the engine block, but it's the passenger side where the thermostat is, or very close to where the belts are. But that engine block is aluminum. Okay, so if that one happens to stop up with mud or dirt daubers or something, there's another weep hole that weeps the water into the valley. You know, that valley in there. Of course, they got that stupid plastic housing on the top where the hose hooks up, and those things like to split and dump water in that valley. But it's just in case that hole down there by the thermostat clogs up, it'll channel that water out through there. Now, Ford doesn't do that. On a Ford, if that water pump failed, it would fill the crankcase up with coolant, which is the dumbest fool thing anybody's ever done. I don't know why they didn't do a better job of that. You know, nobody much that I've ever heard talk about these 2.7s like seeing one come into the shop, because they're kind of a pain. And if you have to put a water pump on one, it's very, very, very difficult. You almost have to pull the motor out to do it. But one way or another, this one came in, and what happened was, you know, the thermostat's here. This is where it goes. It goes, you know, it goes on the front load. You got to. It's better if you know, pull the components out of the way to get to the thermostat. And it's got this funky shaped gasket here. Of course, there's that little hole on the top I was talking about that lets water out. And this little weep hole right here is the one I was talking about, that where the water pump leaks. If you see water pouring out of there, that means you've got a water pump issue on one of these 2.7s. You see these other ones, these other bolt holes, that kind of looks like a bolt hole, but that's not what it is. Anyway, so this guy was working on this thing, and the threads weren't any good in that hole, and secondly, he was going to tap the threads, or he thought he was, with a 6mm thread tap, and he pops the thread tap off in the hole. Now think about what's going on here. You can't just put 2 bolts in that thermostat because it's, you know, 3 holes, 3 bolts establish a plane, and the way that was made, you've got to have 3 bolts in there. This is a 2004 model car, and it's a really nice car, and now we've got an epic disaster that's going on here. And the kid breaks this thing off in there. You know, anybody that's ever worked with young mechanics, so sometimes you have to be an absolute miracle worker to fix some of the stuff that they mess up, you know, just because they're not careful enough. And he wasn't careful enough. He popped that 6mm tap off. I blew this hole up so you can see it was that hole right there was the one that he popped that tap off in. I said, well, you can't just put that and that on there, because I guarantee you that's not going to seal, and it's going to seep and all that. So what I did was that this is not totally to scale, but I found out that these little flutes in this tap right here were exactly the right size, so that if I ran a 1/8 drill bit in each corner of that thing, I was actually able to get that piece of busted tap and turn it a piece of, you know, part of a turn, so that it was these were in those holes, and then I was able to rattle that little piece of a tap out of there. Now, there was a guy that I was working over there next to that was working on one of those J10s, you know, those old Jeeps that they got such awful gas mileage. Well, that was a J10 pickup. It was one of those big Grand Cherokees is what it was. That one of them big V8s in it. And there was a bolt that had broke off in one of the heads. It came in like that. And his job was to drill that bolt out and tap that thing and fix the hole. And he was a pretty settled, you know, competent mechanic. I was really impressed with a lot of the stuff he knew how to do. He was really smart. And so he had his drill, and I don't know if you've ever noticed or not, but if you use an electric drill, you're more likely to break a drill bit than if you use an air drill. Now, you usually won't have the power turning the bit on an air drill, but you'll break the bit on it, you know, with an electric drill. Anyway, he was drilling that thing out with a 3/8 bit, and he got a ways up in there with that thing, drilling it out with a 3/8 electric drill, Makita or something, I don't know what it was. And that thing grabbed up in there on the tip of that bit, you know how they do sometimes when you're about and it popped that bit off smooth up against that. And he was running around waving his hands up in the air saying, I don't know what we're going to do now. You know, we're all going to die here and all that. He was just sick to his stomach. And I went over there and looked at it, and I says, Philip, I says, why don't you take your air hammer and put it right there next to that, where that where that drill bit is stuck. When you think about it, the drill bit's only hung up on the very end anyway. It's not hung up all the way in there like a tap. If a tap breaks off, you got some issues. But I says, just put your air hammer against there and very gently let it slug. Da, 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 da. And that vibration will probably break that busted off drill bit loose from where it's grabbing on the end, and you'll be able to work it out of there. And so, you know, he tried that, and lo and behold, it happened to work, you know. But sometimes you just got to think a little bit and don't panic. Now, it was really easy for me to come up with something for him to try, and he had nothing to lose. Furthermore, I didn't have no dog in that hunt because I wasn't the one that going to have to pull the head off if it didn't work. But it just so happened he was able to get it out of there that way. One way or another, those little 1/8 bits didn't enlarge that hole all that much, but I went in there with the helicoil drill It came with the helicoil set. I tapped it out, and I put a helicoil in there. That's what it looked like when I got done. Put a helicoil in that bolt hole. And whenever it was all over and done with, we put all of the bolts in there, put it back together, and that thing had a thermostat in there. And so here we are. You know, we got that one took care of right there. Now, the Montana, when the engine warmed up with the new thermostat, the blower was still an issue. And this is the blower connector. That actually is a new one. The one that was on the blower was burned up. Sometimes you can take a pocket screwdriver or something and scratch the oxidation off the terminals in the blower. To be perfectly honest, the smart move and the smart play is to go ahead and replace the blower and the blower pigtail. And I think on this one we just scratched the, she said she'd be willing to take a chance by not having to buy a blower if we would just put the pigtail on it. And a lot of the times what I like to do is put some silicone dielectric grease on these terminals when I put them back together. Now, I had talked a little bit before about, you know, the old Motorcraft number was WA10, but even if you look that up now, you'll see some of that dielectric grease, like using on spark plugs. Ford likes using it on brake calipers now, you know, because it's kind of heat resistant. But the point is, if you put that on there, it tends to keep the air from trying to oxidize the metal, and you're less likely to have the thing burn out again if you put some silicone dielectric grease on those, so that there's no air getting in there, because you know the air's got to get in there to oxidize it. And if you seal it out, seal it with that silicone, and that silicone dielectric grease keeps air and water out better than anything I've ever seen, unless you're using some actual sealer. But anyway, that dielectric grease doesn't conduct electricity at all, but it forces the electricity to flow where the metal's touching, you know, instead of, you know, and it also helps keep the terminals cooler, even if there's a little bit, you know, even under high current flow situations. You won't find that written down anywhere, but I found out it has worked. It won't hurt anything to put it in there. It won't cause any kind of a problem, but it may keep you from having some kind of a comeback. This Honda car had lackluster AC performance. All right, so it was a little 97 Civic, and we found a blend of R134A and R12 in there, massive ugly blend. I used to see a lot of that. Sometimes I would see vehicles that still had the R12 fittings, but they would be totally charged up with 134. Like the people had charged it with 134 because 12 was getting so expensive and hard to come by. I still know people that have whole cases of R12 in their garage that they've been saving, or basically in a closet somewhere, because they wanted to have some in case they couldn't. It's kind of silly, you know. R134, you can still buy it pretty reasonable. Then eventually they're probably going to roll into the 1234, which it costs about $80 a pound or something like that, which is, you know, somewhat aggravating. But anyway, this is how you're supposed to do this. You use a special machine. I didn't use my big machine. That machine there, you can buy one like that, and pump it into a bottle that's painted gray with a yellow top. If anybody that knows anything sees that bottle, they'll know it's got a blend of gases in it, and you're not supposed to pump that gas into anything. And so basically I wanted to get all of that trash gas out of there. And the other end of that story is, once you do this, you better have some bottles sitting around that you can, you know, have somewhere to store those bottles. Because if you try to call somebody, I had a couple of bottles of this that that I had filled up with trash gas, and I just got other bottles to, you know, follow up. But I had to keep those bottles of refrigerant in storage, the old trash refrigerant, because if you call Safety Clean or some other recycler to come pick them up that I could find in some part in your part of the country, you might not have this problem. Safety Clean wanted $2,000 to haul away a full bottle of that trash gas, and so I just handed them to it. I had room to store it. This is ridiculous to want $2,000 to, because I guess they didn't know what to do with it, and so to keep you from sending it with them, for them to try to figure out what to do with it, they wanted to charge you such a massive price that you wouldn't want to, use them for that. Anyway, we did that. We refilled it with the right kind of clean cold juice, only to discover the head pressure was shoving the high pressure switch open, 400 psi, and the AC clutch was going bap, 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 bap. It was machine gunning because the switch was bouncing, I guess, or whatever. And what we found on that one was the condenser fan had melted its fuse. Somebody had installed a 30 amp in place of a 20 before it died. The fan motor was also totally open electrically. It probably shorted out and then burned out. But, you know, in an extreme case, you'd wind up having to replace that fuse panel. But it just so happened that we were able to, you know, get a fuse to work in there. So, you know, you might even get a little bit of valve grinding compound or something and smear just a little bit of it on the blades and run that fuse in and out of there a few times to clean that oxidation, and then use some canned air and maybe just a little shot of electrical contact cleaner to wash that off, to get, you know, to kind of make sure that you didn't build up oxidation and resistance right there and have an issue like that again. Now this right here is a chart. Now in a minute I'm going to turn this white so you can pause this and maybe do a screen print of it. I put this together for my students and it works pretty well. Air conditioner doesn't blow cold. Does the compressor engage? If it does, you go down this way and then you follow these lines. So if the pressure's on the low on the suction side, high on discharge sides. Alright, if they are, you want to see if the suction line is cold and the liquid line's hot. If they are, you're going to look at your blend door. Alright, now if the pressures are not lower on the suction side and high on discharge, you're going to check the compressor health and the orifice valve. Or if, you know, if it looks like another one did. So if the pressures look screwy, it's going to be a compressor expansion valve. Occasionally, one time on a Toyota Camry, an older one, we put an expansion valve on it for pressures that were low across the board, and the expansion valve didn't fix it. We had to put an evaporator on it to fix it. That fixed it, which was weird because the evaporator didn't appear to be stopped up. I could blow air through it. Alright, if the compressor doesn't engage, you want to see if it's got at least 60 psi of static pressure, because that's enough to close those switches. If it does, you got to see if the compressor has clutch power, and does the clutch feed wire show a ground with the AC off. When you check it for a ground with the AC off, what you're doing there is you're actually looking to make sure that there's the ground coming back through the compressor clutch. And I may have told you guys about a Nissan Altima that came in. Let me finish this first and then I'll tell you about the Altima. Okay, now, sorry about that. If the compressor clutch, alright, see that other, does it have power? Right, if it doesn't have power, you're going to scan for AC, request, check fuses, relays, and all that kind of stuff. Alright, so does it have 60 psi? I need the refrigerant recharge and test. If the compressor doesn't engage, you're going to go back here. If it does engage, you're going to go here and then come back over here, and so on and so forth. That's a pretty neat little chart, and it works most of the time. But the Altima that I was talking about was, and that's my little until next time slide there. You can see me pouring some coffee next to some ball joints I got on the coffee table. But this lady came on this Nissan Altima that was a 2010 model. She called me and she says, my Altima, the air conditioner just suddenly quit cooling. It was cooling just fine. It just quit. And I went over to this such and such a tire store, and they sent a kid out there with a flashlight, and he checked a couple of fuses and looked around down in there. And he says, we don't know what's wrong with it, but it's going to cost $1,000. And that sounds like a comic strip, but that's literally what they told her. And so that scared her off. So I says, well, why don't we just have a look at it over here and just see what we need to do. And so it was a 4-cylinder Altima. She came over there, and I found the wire that was going down to the compressor. And you can do this without starting the engine or anything with the key switched off. And I got a test light, and I hooked it to power. And I went into the wire going down to the AC compressor clutch. You got to make sure you're in the right wire, or you can go to the relay and do it. You got to make sure you know which relay terminal is going down to the compressor clutch. You should see a ground there coming back through the compressor clutch coil. On hers, it was open. And I says, okay, we got a couple of choices here. We can put you a clutch coil on there, but it's pretty expensive right by itself if you get a clutch coil. You typically are going to want to get a clutch and a hub too. And by the time you buy that, you could buy a compressor. And so anyway, she said, let's just put a compressor on it. Okay, the labor time on changing that compressor is 8/10 of 1 hour. You can look it up. 2010 Nissan Altima, 8/10 of 1 hour to change the compressor, because it's really easy. And we pulled, I think that seemed like we put a dryer on it and whatever else, and then, the right amount of oil, and sucked it down, charged it up. She had good cold air, and she was happy. And I don't know, I think her bill was $350 or something like that. So she went on her way with a big smile on her face. That same day, I got a call from another town, a different town than this lady had come from. And she says, my Altima 2010, it's another 2010 Altima on the same day. And she called and she says, my Altima air conditioner has quit. And I went by such and such a tire store and some other, it was not one of the same tire store, it was a different one. And she says, and they said it needed a compressor and it was going to cost $1,000. And I says, good grief, everybody's wanting to charge $1,000. And I said, did you ask them why it was so much? And I said, she says, yeah, I asked them why it was going to be $1,000. And they said the labor was 7.5 hours. And so it was going to cost $1,000 parts and labor. And I said, that's nonsense, because you can look that up in the labor guide, and the labor for changing an Altima air conditioner compressor is only like less than an hour. Now the other, you want to charge them for pulling it down and charging it up and maybe changing the dryer and all. But I mean, good grief, that was just, seemed to me like highway robbery. And I understand shops have got to make a living. I'm not saying everybody ought to do something for free, but a lot of these shops that I've known about, my aunt, I think I told you about that the other day, she took her Crown Victoria, and it was an old 92 model, and hadn't never been driven all that much or all that hard, and she went to a store, a tire store somewhere, to get an oil change or something. They told her it needed $750 worth of front end work, and so she didn't have the money to do that, and so she had them put it on the ground and finish the oil change, and she brought it over to where I was, and I raised it up on the lift. There wasn't so much as a busted boot on any ball joint or any tie rod in, and everything was tight. I don't know why they were trying to sell her that kind of stuff, but that particular shop was not one that I ever use anyway. I got another shop around here that I trust, because he won't ever sell anybody something they don't need, and he's real fair with everything he does. But that shop over there, that's not the first time I'd seen that. They'll tell somebody they need $700 or $800 worth of front end parts, because people are scared not to let them do it. I don't know what the deal is, but when you go behind somebody and you can't understand why they made that, and that's not the only time I saw that, and that's not the only place I saw that happen. But anyway, I'm not, I don't want to talk smack too many times about about shops that are just trying to keep their head above water. But if if somebody needs the work, sell them the work and charge them, but try to go by book time and not just make a price up off the top of your head like we don't know what's wrong with it, but we think it'll cost $1,000. A lot of customers don't mind paying $1,000 if they know it's going to be fixed. Anyway, that's about it. I rambled for a little bit this time, and I'll see you guys next time. And I hope I didn't make anybody mad with these last couple of 3 stories I told. Talk to you later.